Hi, Chris from New Zealand. This is a video about the Cleveland oiling problem and more specifically what actually is the cause or causes of the problem. I think this Cleveland oiling issue is probably one of the most widely discussed topic on a lot of Cleveland forums, and probably the most misunderstood as well. Some time ago I got sick of all the parrot talk, people saying that this works for them, other people saying that something else works for them, but there was no real information out there regarding what creates the actual problem. I think this is largely driven by the 70s era pro stock races and the extent that they went to convert their engines into priority main oiling systems in an effort to make their very high rev engines survive. Having actually found the problem, a lot of these mods are totally unnecessary. I think there's so many stories repeated on this oiling issue that it's not funny. It's in every tech paper, it's on every tech forum. But as I said, having found the problem, I'll try my best to explain it here. So, I have backup for this as well, which is in a technical paper I found specifically on oiling issues, and that ties in exactly with what the Clevelands are doing. And also independent validation, if you like, was provided by a successful Queensland drag racer by the name of Paul Dilly. Paul's having the usual issues despite trying all the accepted fixes, including bushing lifters, restrictor kits, rear oil lines, etc. But he was still having issues. He went to some trouble to track me down. Having seen some of my blurb on the Cleveland forums many years ago, and I passed this information on to him, which he put into practice. So he's kindly also done a video on his experiences and relating to this and other Cleveland oiling tidbits as well. Both the technical paper and a link to his video in the description box down below. So let's get into it. I think any Cleveland enthusiast knows that this oiling issue or the oiling problem invariably starts at number 2 and number 7 big N. So with that in mind, and also the extent that a lot of people are going to try and convert into mains priority or a semi-mains priority system, I started with the blocks. And for those of you that don't know, and I'm sure most of you do that are here, the Cleveland oiling system looks like this. It's fed from the pump up to the filter, of course, upper gallery to a cross gallery. From there it splits into two, goes into front cam bearing and the front main, and another gallery that runs up to the right hand side main gallery, which has intersecting lifters, of course, along the way. From this gallery it's feeding down to each main and back up to each conrod bearing as it goes. This cross passage here is simply the way that they drilled the block. Some people put restrictors or plugs in there, some don't. At the rear of the block it feeds down to the rear main bearing, up to the rear cam bearing, and then it's got another passage that offshoots into the left hand side lifter gallery. All in all, it's very basic and simple sort of system really. Arguably the small block sheaves are regarded as idiot proof, under sane conditions anyway. So I got a 350 sheave block out and put it side by side with the Cleveland block. For those of you that don't know, the mooring system looks like this. I've got the rear mounted pump, of course, feeding into the filter. There's a gallery that goes up to the top of the block, back down and into this central gallery. At the rear, it is simultaneously fed into the left and right hand lifter gallery as well as coming down to the rear cam bearings, similar setup all the way. From there it feeds around the outside of the cam bearing in a channel that's cut in the block and eventually ends up at the mains. It's not a true priority main setup by any stretch of the imagination, just for the simple reason that it's feeding both the left and right hand lifter galleries at the same time it's feeding the rest, plus the fact that it's feeding the cam bearings first and the mains last. Another difference between the two is the gallery sizes in the small block sheave are 7/16. Cleveland is much larger at 9/16. I think that would make it more susceptible to a pressure loss, but the Cleveland pump is also much larger than the small block sheave, so I believe as long as supply is not getting interrupted, that shouldn't really be a problem. The other factor which is really different between the two, of course, is the lifter galleries intersecting this main right hand gallery on the Cleveland. Excuse me. And I considered that the lifters intersecting as they do may be causing a problem. It's certainly not going to cause a problem as far as flow goes, because the passage is much larger anyway. But I did consider whether the actual lifter action itself may have been causing a disturbance in the oil flow or perhaps some aeration. Given the fact that it's affecting number 2 and number 7 rod bearing only first, I discounted that. The problem, if it was a problem, it should be progressively getting worse as it gets the rear of the block, and it should be affecting the mains and the other rod bearings as well. I also know from experience that pushing the lifters does not cure the problem. The next block I decided to get out and have a look at was an LS block. And for those of you that don't know, it's got a front crank mounted pump. From there it runs down a long gallery to near the rear of the block where it goes out to the filter, back in from the filter, right to the rear of the block, and has a gallery that runs up to this area, which has sort of a central pocket or gallery type area where it splits into left and right hand lifter galleries. The left lifter gallery feeds down slicing past the cam bearing as it goes, which it feeds, and finally to the main locks last. It's interesting to note that along this main feed gallery, if you like, the lifters are intersecting this passage all the way along, exactly the way that the Cleveland does. It's also interesting to note that the gallery sizes are the same as the Cleveland at 9/16. Looking at these two, they're very similar actually. Perhaps this should potentially be slightly worse, as it's feeding both left and right lifter galleries simultaneously, where the Cleveland is only feeding the right hand side one first. The remainder, what's left of the oil supply, is going to the left, of course. Based on what I could see, I discounted that the block itself was the problem. The next thing I thought, I got small block sheave crank and Cleveland crank out, put them side by side. Most obvious thing, of course, is the fact that both mains and big ends are smaller on the small block sheave, smaller diameter. And as we all know in that regard, smaller is better, both for decreased bearing speed and also decreased oil demand. However, there's plenty of larger journal cranks that survive in higher RPM engines and other applications, other engines. So whilst it's an advantage, it's not really mandatory for crank or bearing survival. So it was also very obvious that the drillings in the crank itself, the galleries from mains to big ends, were quite different in the way that they were drilled. I think most of you would know or understand that number one main in the block is only feeding number one rod big end. Number two is feeding number 2 and 5 big end. 3 is 3 and 6, 4 is 4 and 7, and so on. You'd expect the holes that are drilled in the crankshaft to be 180 degrees apart on those throws, but in actual fact they're not. For 2 and 5, these mains to big end drillings are actually 120 degrees apart, and it's the same for 4 and 7. On number 3, they are in fact 180 degrees apart. So I looked at that aspect as far as oil clocking goes. I'm quite sure that 95% of people use half groove main bearing shells these days. The reason being, of course, that we're told they're better, they can withstand higher load, etc., etc. So what this does, your bearing shell, let's grab a pen here. The bearing shell sits in here with its half groove main. The bottom shell is a plain shell. Oops. So what is actually occurring here, as the crank is rotating and this main to big end drilling gets exposed to the oil supply, it's clocking on or turning on at this point as the crank is rotating. When it gets to this point over here, of course it's clocking off. So there's little to no actual oil feed when its oil hole is in the bottom of in this main cap area. So at that point I looked at the actual clocking of number 2 and number 5. 4 and 7 are the same, but we'll just look at 2 and 5. So number 2, big end, it's supplied due to this oil clocking. It's clocking on around 90 degrees after top dead centre, and it is clocking off at 90 degrees before top dead centre. Due to the 120 degree apart spacing of these oil holes in the actual main, number 5 is slightly different. It is slightly advanced. So it's clocking on around 120 degrees past top dead centre, and it's clocking off around 60 degrees before top dead centre. The other aspect of this 120 degrees apart is there is a period where the actual oil supply is shared between 2 and 5 at the same time. And I'll draw that in here. And the shared oil supply for number 5 is in this area here. And on number 2 it is in this area. I'm sure we can all understand that the period of maximum cylinder pressure is in this area. So in both cases it's really giving the oiling shot after the horse is bolted, if you like. The cylinder, it's after that period of maximum cylinder pressure. Of note is on the small block sheave crank, the oil supply clocks on at top dead centre just prior to maximum cylinder pressure and clocks off at bottom dead centre. So it's obviously getting a much more beneficial oiling shot. However, if we look at number 2 and we think of it, this shared supply, as say your garden hose, you turn the tap on, you have one tap on the line, and you have X amount of volume and supply coming out of that tap that you have on your line. If you put another tap on the line and open it at the same time, of course pressure and volume is reduced at both. So in this aspect, because number 5 is getting oiled after this period of maximum cylinder pressure, this area of overlap where it's shared isn't quite so bad. Of more notice is this area is giving number 5 a much better oiling shot prior, and it's also later, prior to this maximum period of cylinder pressure. Whereas number 2, it's obviously getting the shared supply in its final stages, which results in it not getting anywhere near as good an oiling shot as what number 5 is. This in itself explains why number 2 and number 7, because it's the same, suffering from this problem. At that point I sort of thought I'd found most of the problem, if you like. But there is another aspect to it as well. People that are running Clevelands will know if you running to 7,000 plus revs on a regular basis. The problem just isn't confined to number 4 and number 7. It starts eating up other bearings as well. So with that in mind, and given this different oil clocking aspect of it, it's quite obvious that the drilling from the main to the big end, which is represented in this diagram, this is looking at the crankshaft from the front, looking end on, this representing the main, this representing the big end. So number 1 throw, if you like. So it's obviously with the different oil clocking aspect between the Chev and the Ford that the mains, where the main drilling starts, is obviously different, which it is. On the Ford, it runs from around 5 o'clock on the main to around 1 o'clock on the big end. However, on the small block Chev, it's running from around 9 o'clock on the main to around about 1:30 or so on the big end. Now, I knew this had to be having an effect, and I couldn't really work out what it was. So I drew this on a piece of cardboard, and I poked the end of a pen through the centre of it, and I spun it in my fingers, and I could see exactly what was going on. And you can probably visualise that yourselves, or you could try that yourselves. As the crank rotates, this gallery is rotating entirely around the rotational centre of the crankshaft. Compare that with the small block Chev, and it's actually crossing the rotational centre line. I hunted around the internet for some time looking for some information about what this would actually do, and I eventually found that, and it's in the form of that technical paper I mentioned earlier, linked down the bottom. And it was done, I think, by Suzuki, and they did it with a crankshaft that was drilled virtually exactly the same as what a Cleveland or a Ford crank is. What they found, by the way, there's also quite a lot of good information in there about the oil clocking aspect of it as well. So I urge you to go and have a look at that, because it really explains what's going on. But getting back to this aspect of it, what they found, and they did this by cutting a slice through the crankshaft, and they put a piece of perspex over it, and with the aid of a high-speed camera they actually took photos. And as the revs rose, an aeration area appeared here, around halfway between the main and the big end. So, and that aeration area, of course, upset oil supply greatly. And the higher they turned the engine, the less volume of oil that was actually supplied to the big end. It's also worth noting that one of the fixes that they tried was adding an extra gallery in here, which they called a V passage. And this was twofold. It was also as a help to this aeration cavity that was forming, and it also helped greatly with the oil clocking aspect of it. A similar sort of fix is, because it is, for most of us, it's not really viable to try re-drilling a crank like that, but also another way of fixing or doing the same thing that this passage is doing is by simply using fully grooved mains grooved on the top and the bottom, which eliminates the oil clocking aspect of it. Sorry, we had to do a restart there due to a rainstorm coming through. It's worth noting that all aftermarket cranks that we've come across have been drilled in the sheave style, which eliminates this problem, of course. So, to sum up, and I hope this hasn't been too boring, I've tried to explain exactly what is happening. And it is, of course, twofold. It's caused by the clocking and also the way that the galleries are drilled in the crankshaft itself. So, what are the fixes for it? As we've already mentioned, full groove mains does eliminate the clocking aspect of it, and also helps with the aeration aspect. And that is the simplest, quickest fix for most people. The other one, of course, is to replace the crank itself with an aftermarket one. You'll notice that, or you've probably seen, excuse me, you've probably seen several people on the Cleveland forums or Ford forums, and they've had a problem, or they've rebuilt their engine and they've gone to the extent of bushing lifter bores or adding restricted kits, etc., as well as using the ever popular stroker crank, and suddenly their oil problem is gone, and they seem to think that their oiling mods have actually done the trick, but in fact it's the aftermarket crank and the way it's drilled is actually what's fixed the problem. Anybody that's sort of thinking about this will probably be thinking, well, why don't the Windsors have this problem? The cranks are drilled in the same way that the Cleveland cranks are, and is it because of the priority main oiling in the block itself? I'll answer that in two ways, and the first one is the 351 Windsor definitely does have this problem. You start revving them hard and it starts eating number 2 and number 7 big end bearing. The 289-302s don't suffer as badly due to the shorter stroke, of course, which helps in this aspect, but they also have another little trick to them which most people don't know about. And if you look at a stock crank, this gallery is actually tapered. It's larger at this end, smaller at that end, and the effect of that is there is more oil volume at the main end and less volume at the big end bearing, and that helps with this problem here. I'm sure if you rev them hard enough for long enough, similar issues will happen. I'm going to call it there. I hope I haven't bored you too much, but I hope you get something out of it. I urge you to excuse me, I urge you to have a look at Mr. Dilly's video and his experiences. There's a lot of information there, and it validates all this as well. The real kicker to this is the fact that Ford actually knew about this, and you'd be thinking, well, why would he say something like that? And the simple reason is that they spec the 351 Boss with fully grooved mains, and that must tell you something. Right, I hope this is of benefit to somebody. We've known about this for some time, like I said, and thought we would make it a bit more public. Hopefully it might help some of you guys that are running, especially those running stock cranks. So we'll leave it at that. Okay, bye.